Hey, folks, and welcome to today's International Non-Binary Day event. I am Sera Fernando. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Management Analyst for the Office of LGBTQ Affairs. Also with me is Daniel Moretti from the Office of LGBTQ Affairs, and we're bringing you this event live in celebration of International Non-Binary Peoples Day. So thank you so much for joining us. We have an amazing panel event set for you this evening. Just to give you a little bit of background about what the Office of LGBTQ Affairs is all about, we provide leadership and support for the well-being and longevity of LGBTQ communities in Santa Clara County through coordinated, integrated, and approaches. If you want to find more about us, you could just simply keyword search anywhere, Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs, or across social media at LGBTQ SCCGOV. That is a lot of letters, but if you type in Santa Clara County Office of LGBTQ Affairs, you could find that on any social media. But let's get started. International Non-Binary Peoples Day. It's observed every July 14th, and the aim is in raising awareness and organizing around the issues faced by non-binary people around the world. Again, we have an amazing group of speakers here to share their stories and experiences living in their non-binary authenticity. So what I will do is I want to make sure that I introduce each and every one of them. So first up, we have B. Pagels Minor. B is a native of Mississippi who relocated to Silicon Valley in 2018 from Chicago. B identifies as a trans non-binary lesbian. B is an enthusiast for anything technology related, as well as randomly obscure trivia facts. B is a thought leader on product and culture development within technology companies. They are passionate about creating a culture of accountability and sustainable process that allows teams to just do the work well. Everyone give it up for B. Hey, B. Up next, we have Joseph Galvan. Joseph grew up in Gilroy, California as a young gay youth at a challenging time in their small town community, experienced bullying through grade school all the way up to high school. They were fortunate enough to make lifelong friends along the way and became involved in school clubs and eventually began volunteering at the LGBTQ Speakers Bureau. This led them to where they are today as a South County Outreach Coordinator for the LGBTQ youth space. Everybody, give it up for Joseph. Up next, we have Cordelia Kiki Larson. Cordelia is a San Jose native working with the Hero Tent at the Black Lives Matter protests. They also majored in musical theater, last performing and working as the dance captain for the production of She Loves Me at the Southway Musical Theater, a company with which they provide assistance through Diversity Board. They have a deep passion for socioeconomic justice and educational accessibility. Everybody give it up for Cordelia. Up next, we have Benny Arana O'Hara. Benny is an artist, activist, and community organizer in San Jose. They are currently entering their second year in the Masters of Social Work program at San Jose State University and doing census engagement and education work with the LGBTQ communities through Queers Count 2020. Benny works in community mental health and will be interning at Santa Clara County Department of Family and Children's Services next year. Everybody give it up for Benny. And last but not least, we have Manu. Manu is a non-binary femme who is dedicated to creating and facilitating safe spaces for non-binary folks to explore and process their gender. They are interested in learning about more about how gender shows up with folks who identify on the non-binary spectrum. Manu facilitates a weekly non-binary support group through the Billy DeFrank LGBTQ Community Center that meets virtually every Thursday at 8 p.m. It is open to folks who identify as non-binary and or are questioning their gender identity. Everybody, give it up for Manu. All right. So this is where I invite everyone that's on this panel to come off mute. I know it's like, I want to hear y'all, but welcome y'all and thank you all for coming out this evening. Let's go ahead and get started with this celebration. So Non-Binary Peoples Day. It's an international event and it's growing in popularity. Every July 14th, we celebrate it. And you see, like I saw it throughout my social media, so many people in celebration. So what does Non-Binary Peoples Day mean to you? Who wants to get to start us off? I'm gonna go to Cordelia first.
So to me, Non-Binary Peoples Day is a day for us to celebrate our own validity and celebrate our own identities in a space that is not defined by others. Something that I often run into, especially in the queer and trans communities, is other people wanting to label or identify my gender and my expression because I am a very femme-presenting non-binary individual. A lot of times I am faced with, I don't want to say disbelief, but it's not taken as seriously as someone who would present a little more gender fluidly or would present a little less assigned birth gender. And to have a day dedicated to all levels of expression on any form, you know, that's something so unifying and so special to me.
Awesome, thanks for sharing. Who wants to go next? I'm gonna go to B.
Yeah, it's actually really funny. And I think, Sarah, I've mentioned this to you before that in
Yeah.
some ways, when I moved to California, it's like the first time I've ever celebrated so many things that have to do with my identity because it's the first time I've been in a space and worked at companies who care enough to give me the space to celebrate. In fact, like in theory, I knew non-binary People's Day has existed for a while, right? Like, it's been around since 2012. It's something that folks celebrate. But this is the first year in my entire life, and I've only been out since really 2014, 2015, that I actually, at work, we got an email about it. We talked about it, and so it's so powerful in that sense. So I actually say, like, I feel like a little bit of a virgin right now where I'm just like, well, it's so exciting because this is my first real one, so it's just kind of like that really interesting experience for me to, have been a part of this community for so long, but actually feel like I'm finally celebrating for the first time now.
That's so awesome to hear. And I think for a lot of us, I'm not sure if anybody on this call ever has done a panel event, but again, this is the first time I'm seeing something celebrated. And again, it's so grateful for me to be able to speak with everyone on this panel because this is something that we want to continually elevate because I love sharing stories. So, right, Lisa, I think that being here for today's non-binary event is super important. Thanks for being on. Manu, I'm going to go to you because you have your mic turned off or on. So, Manu, what does Non-Binary People's Day mean to you?
For me, it means celebrating, honoring, and centering voices of all non-binary folks, whether or not they look like the stereotype, non-binary person. It's really about celebrating all of the different ways that a non-binary person can exist in this world.
Yeah, absolutely. And celebrating those stories and celebrating the people, super important. I think several people are saying it's a little hard to hear you, so you might want to speak up. It's because Manu's in the jungle, so. But thank you for sharing, Manu. Let's go to Joseph. So, Joseph, what does non-binary People's Day mean to you?
I mean, a lot what have folks have already been saying, it's an opportunity for us to kind of gather, or in this year at least virtually gather, and be a community together. And, I think oftentimes it's easy for folks in non-binary community to, feel othered quite often, even within our own queer and trans communities. And it's just so empowering to see so many folks who are non-binary out in the world, but also here today. So, I mean, just awesome, and glad we could come together in this way. So celebrate.
Yes. And what's awesome is that even after we selected you folks, and you folks are all leaders within this community, there's so many folks that I just thought about. It's like, oh my, we missed out on a lot of folks that identify as non-binary that aren't on here. So maybe we need to expand into greater programming, right? So it's really awesome and really delightful to see you folks here. And Benny, what does non-binary People's Day mean to yourself?
I think it's, just kind of an opportunity to, I guess, take that time to like recognize our community and sort of, I think even within like LGBTQ and even within trans spaces, there's like a lot of sort of subtle erasure of non-binary people in that space, whether it's, going to like a trans event and people are saying, trans brothers and sisters, and it's like, well, what about us?
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's the opportunity to like set aside, something that specifically recognizes this group that kind of gets erased and passed over a lot in a lot of situations. And also just kind of creating our own validity because there's so much like invalidation of non-binary identities.
Yeah, I greatly appreciate what you said there. And let's get into the power of words, because in terms of terminology, in terms of language, the power of words, such as non-binary, trans non-binary, intersectionality, they, them, z, zim, zer, all of them are amazing, yet many folks don't understand the importance of language when it comes to the non-binary community. I think, Benny, you said it in terms of saying ladies and gentlemen or saying brothers and sisters. Being able to be inclusive of everyone, that's something that everyone is learning. And this is what non-binary day is all about, making sure that we don't only celebrate, but we also educate a little bit. So that being said, can anybody on the panel talk a little bit about the importance of language when it comes to the non-binary community?
I'll jump off on that. Oh.
Okay.
It's all good. Well, it's actually funny. So I actually think in some ways my southernness actually prepared me perfectly for this because, we say y'all, we say folks, and those are just terms that we should use, right? But I also think so. I generally work in tech, right? And so in tech, it's definitely a space that is primarily male dominated. And so I think even beyond, my non-binary identity, when you work in spaces or when you're in spaces where, one gender dominates, that's when language becomes even more important, right? Like you want to be very precise and inclusive in how you use your language. And I also should say personally, there's this thing for me that I always tell folks that I even kind of hate pronouns, right? Because in some ways, pronouns at their base create the opportunity to be confusing, right? If someone's saying she, her, they, them, zir, like that could be misconstrued, like who you actually referencing. But when you say be, I need you to do this, like there's no confusion on my part that you're literally talking about me and who I am versus the other ways that language can kind of be misconstrued. And so for me, language is this very powerful thing and a common, thing that, a lot of my people I admire, whether it's Oprah or Maya Angelou or Crystal from the Read podcast, they all say the same thing, which is words mean things, right?
Yeah.
And so by using precise language and using appropriate language for the individual, you're empowering them. And I also, often say that, a lot of folks that are a part of the general, LGBTQ community or the non-binary community, we wake up every day with our glass already half empty, right? Because we already know when we wake up that the people potentially are going to misgender us, they're going to be disrespectful to us, they're going to be hurtful in some way. And so by using the correct pronouns or the correct way that I like to be identified, you're helping me fill my glass back up, right? And so all that we're really asking is for people to keep our glass as full as possible so we can be the full people that we want to be in terms of how we operate in this world.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Cordelia?
For me, the importance of language is most prevalent in theater. I actually was part of a panel seemingly forever ago. COVID time, man, just gets away from you. But I was part of a shelter-in-place panel with Southway Musical Theater talking about how we approach inclusivity in our boards, in our productions, in just the day-to-day functions of a theatrical space. And one thing that I continually tried to bring up was the importance of inclusive language when it comes to casting breakdowns, when it comes to even the shows that you're doing in those spaces, the productions that you put on in film and TV, to mirror the communities that you claim to support and to include us in the stories that you are telling. A lot of times you'll come across casting breakdowns that are very rigid in their gender roles and are very rigid in their racial identities. And that's a barrier that very, very greatly needs to be dismantled at this point in time. So to me, I always focus on the power of language through theater and trying to emphasize to creatives and to directors that there is nothing wrong with casting someone of a different gender in a role that would typically be male, female, in a role that would typically be, white. To cast a minority, non-binary person, that's significant. That's not just something you do as a publicity stunt. That's you unlearning the white patriarchal jargon of theater.
One of the things I'd like to add on to, in terms of like the importance of language within, both the non-binary and trans community in general. I think that a lot of people kind of underestimate the significance of is, for a lot of trans people, language is the only information we have to identify where we're physically safe as well, not just emotionally. And so I think if you're in a role where you're providing healthcare or any kind of services, or, whether you're just providing support to a friend or whatever it is, language is how we identify who is safe, because a lot of times you really don't, especially when you're going through that disclosure process, you don't have any other information about who it's safe to do that with, or where your identity is going to be respected and protected. And the biggest way that I think a lot of people are able to immediately identify, who in the room is going to be supportive to them or not, is by recognizing who is using language that is respectful to the way that people want to be identified. So it's not just about, how it makes you feel. I personally, have dysphoria about some things in language and don't experience dysphoria in other areas. And so, that kind of goes person by person, but regardless of how I feel about a word emotionally, I appreciate when people put forth the effort to try to mirror the language that I use, because for me, that gesture is helpful for identifying what the intention is.
Very nicely said. Thank you. So in terms of some of the misconceptions regarding non-binary identity, what do you folks feel might be the more prevalent misconceptions when it comes to talking about the greater gender spectrum? And I was talking to Daniel about this the other day, where there's these two graphs, right? So picture A has male, female, non-binary right in the middle, and then the next picture, and it's a meme, I think. The next picture goes male, female, and non-binary within like non-binary, like all over the place. So, what are some common misconceptions that are regarding within the greater gender spectrum when it comes to non-binary folks?
If I started,
Yeah, go ahead.
Now I'm like closer to the mic, I promise.
Okay.
This was a question that really resonated for me as a non-binary femme. I feel like sometimes, there's this like misconception that there's one way to look non-binary or to be non-binary, and I feel like a lot of times that depiction is to be androgynous or to be white and skinny and dress a certain way. And I think the beautiful part of especially this panel in itself is proof that there's no one way that you can be non-binary. Non-binary doesn't always equal androgyny. It doesn't equal anything. It's, existing in your gender the way that you feel authentic. And so having this day, it's also about showing visibility in terms of like there's so many different ways to express and experience your gender, and like no one way to be non-binary is any more valid than the other. And that's really been so important to me because I feel like even within queer spaces, even within non-binary spaces, I still feel like sometimes my non-binary identity is not, you know, folks will like misgender me, especially on days when I feel super femme. I'm still misgendered, and like I feel like I notice that when I'm presenting more masculine, folks validate my gender identity more, and I feel like that in itself is problematic. I'm just as non-binary when I'm, you know, presenting one way than the other, and I think that that's really important to discuss.
Thanks for sharing, Manu.
Something that has been really concerning to me is like the conflation of trans and non-binary, right? Because, you know, if you're trans non-binary, that doesn't necessarily mean, like, if you're trans, it does not necessarily mean you're non-binary. And if you're non-binary, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're trans. And so, you know, especially amongst like a lot of groups, like they like to just say TG and C and think that covers it. But the fact is that, you know, as a non-binary person, you can be in a trans group and have none of your opinions or ideas reflected in the rest of that group. So it still is like you're like this one piece of the puzzle. I also think that, you know, I really want to, you know, my news point is so important. Like I am masculine of center, but I'm never gonna pick up a hammer or some screwdrivers or do any of that. Like I'm gonna have on an apron that's pink in the kitchen making cocktails for my wife, who's very femme, who will be doing those types of things, right? And so I think that there's also like this there's still this performative nature of gender that is put on us, and it feels like very unfair. It's like I don't want to perform your gender norms. I'm very comfortable with mine. And I just want to exist as myself and not have to be a part of like all these other groups that I kind of keep getting put into.
All right, thanks for sharing. And I know that non-binary folks, specific with y'all, and me identifying as a trans woman, non-binary folks even more so are leading the charge when it comes to making the usage of pronouns or the using your name as an identifier or making it visible with gender pronouns and making that commonplace when it comes to like email signatures, when it comes to name badges, when it comes to any kind of like introductions, when you occupy any kind of space. Saying your name and your pronouns, for me as a trans woman, I feel that's empowering. For the non-binary community, I feel that's even more empowering because when you say that they them pronoun, if you choose to disclose that, then you are in essence challenging a lot of the folks, especially in non-queer spaces, right? So with that being said, what are some tips that some of you folks can share in using non-binary pronouns in probably non-queer spaces?
Can I share? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to mention that this is the first year of my life where I'm very publicly non-binary and very adamant about using they, them pronouns. I mean, it's been a process for me. I used to be like she, they, then it was just like, just say Manu. And now it's like they, them feels good right now. It might change in the future. I don't know. But this year I was looking for jobs, and it was my first time wanting to find a job where I'm out as a non-binary person and where, you know, I feel like I need to disclose my pronouns and I need to make sure that they're respected. And that was really scary for me because, you know, coming out like in a space, I don't know how that's going to be taken from other folks, but I did accept a job in a STEM lab, and like everyone, even at my interview when I disclosed my pronouns, they were very supportive. And my, you know, the team members in my lab, like they even added their pronouns and their email signature. And it's really like ways like that that folks can show solidarity and show like active allyship. And like it's just been so nice. And like, you know, it's creating a safe space for me when I was so scared that like, this is like, what if they just don't get it? But like they do. So that's been nice. And it's the first time I've ever been out about my pronouns in like a work space. So I guess like, you know, like like more like cis folks, like to be active allies, to have emails with your pronouns, to ask people their pronouns when you talk to them, when you have meetings, like things like that. It's very validating, and it's normalizing that there's gender outside of the binary.
Agree. And I know Joseph, you had your mic off for a second. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I think Manu said a lot of, what I was feeling, but like, it's so important, especially in the workplace when you're serving anyone in the community, to show that you're knowledgeable of different communities other than the ones maybe you associate with or belong to. Um, so it's always great when you see folks who are not maybe in the community making that a common practice, and just like knowing that you're not really going to ever become proficient in non-binary pronouns, or any pronouns of folks who are gender expansive without practicing it. So remembering it's okay to slip, um, but people recognize when you're making an effort, and so just to remember that, and um, just, like what we were saying earlier, language is powerful in the sense that it signifies respect by either what we say or how we say it.
Mm-hmm.
And so just making sure that you make space to respect everyone in the room.
Yes. And I like how you said in terms of having somewhat of a growth mindset when people are learning language, being able to, correct and just move on and just go through that learning process. A lot of people are learning at this phase, and it's really cool that non-binary folks are really taking charge of this. Even though it's like you have to be an advocate, even though it's kind of like forced advocacy, but at the same time, it's really cool to hear folks talk about that. I see a B. You have your mic off, so go ahead.
Yeah, so there's two things that I'm thinking of. So first and foremost, everything everyone else said is obviously perfect, but it's also like when we talk about this forced advocacy, like don't apologize to me. Like it gets so awkward, right? Like one of the things, so one, I just think it's weird when someone messes up my pronouns and they go, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm learning." I'm like, well, like it's like implied that you're learning, right? Because I had to correct you and like whatever. But it also creates a situation where I have to, show them I've accepted their apology, which is weird, right? Because like it's like one, it probably shouldn't have happened, and two, like I don't really like being put on the spot to, take someone's apology. So something like one of the people I recently met who is like an amazing leader, and he was just like, you know what? He's like, you know what? I messed up right there. It's not going to happen again. Let's move on. And I was like, this is perfect. This is the perfect way to handle that. It wasn't awkward. It was so seamless. He took his accountability, and then he made a promise to me, even in that moment, that he's not going to do it again. And also, he's not done it again, right? So I love that type of like allyship, because it didn't create any pressure on me. And then secondly, my company in particular, and a lot of the organizations I've been working with, we have a lot of written communication, right? And actually, so like it's like the in-person is actually becoming better, where like people are really great about using the right pronouns in person, but in written communication, it becomes like, oh, they mess up. And so we were actually just doing some work on like not using, like there's this class that we took that's like, no, don't bullshit, right? And it talked about like no weasel words and all these other things. And I was like, also include pronouns in that, right? If you're writing something, does the pronoun actually enhance what you're writing or make it more confusing? And then all of a sudden, when you start looking at it, you're like, oh wait, actually this made it super confusing. I probably should have just used that person's name or used that person's title, because that's much more descriptive, and it allows us to be more successful in communicating our thing. Because that's the other part of it, right? It's also this communication mechanism. It's like, can you effectively communicate with me or the audience that is working with me if you are using the wrong pronouns, if you're not actually using precise language? So it also goes into this again, this is not just for us, right? This is also for you to be more successful in what you're trying to accomplish as well.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing. In terms of, and I have a question. I think this is going to go out to you, B. You said you work in tech. And in terms of like non-binary representation and more intersectional representation, being able to be an active ally has shown success in like a lot of businesses. Just we know that like diversity and inclusion is a catchphrase. To me, it's a catchphrase at least. For companies to say that, oh, we're inclusive and da 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 da. But in your experience, B, how does a non-binary and or intersectional representation, how does that look like within greater tech? Is it something that's improving, or is it something that's just, it is what it is, just to gain a dollar?
So it's very interesting. So I've definitely worked at organizations that are performing, and I've also worked in organizations that it's very close to their heart and they do a very great job at it. So, and I should say, and then I also have to, divide this up, right? Because I am Black, I am trans, I am non-binary, and I'm a lesbian. So there's a whole bunch of different groups that I join. I join these organizations, and there's lots of different representations that I participate in, and it varies along that spectrum. Like, for instance, right now, as a Black person, I feel more heard and more loved in a tech capacity and tech corporations than I've ever felt in my entire life. However, I'm still, I think, one of like 4 or 5 non-binary people in like my entire, multiple thousand people company, right? Or at least out non-binary people. So while, folks are like really doing a good job of like learning and understanding these things, it still means that they haven't really figured out how to tackle every issue that might come up with me. So for instance, I take tea, and my doctor has a very specific prescription for me because I have no desire to become a man, but I am on tea. Well, our policy does not have a policy for that, right? Like, they've only ever considered like, there are trans men, trans women, and the things that those folks need are very clear. But you have this nuance of this person who's coming in saying, no, I actually just want my testosterone to be like 1% higher than, a normal woman, and 25% lower than a normal man, right? And so that's the type of complication that there's still like this need to have the conversation and have folks actually have these experiences because they've never happened before, right? And even for myself, as someone who is living this experience, a lot of these things have never happened to me before as well, right? So I don't even know the types of things I need to be advocating for. But what I will say is that I think there's a combination of, the good thing about tech is that it's so large. There are different questions that tech is trying to answer. And so that's also inspiring the partners that go along with tech. So healthcare providers, like the medical services, like there's these new medical programs that just help you navigate health services that didn't exist. For instance, when a lot of my trans elders were coming up, like they were like, none of this stuff existed. So there's no one to help me advocate for myself. So there's all these like wraparound services that are being developed, which I think is really where the sweet spot happens, because the wraparound services are the ones who are talking about all of these like things that your actual tech company isn't talking about, because no one in the tech company has that experience. But they happen to say, well, you're probably going to have a person who's going to come up with this thing. Do you want to go ahead and get that service? And then they get to say yes. Right. And because they get that education, then by the time I get there, a lot of those things already exist. So I would say that, 2020, although it's been one of the shittiest years ever, has also been this amazing opportunity for all these companies to learn all these new things. And hopefully they will kind of continue with this momentum moving forward.
Yeah, thanks for sharing it. That reminds me of back when I used to work for a tech company, how I came out around 6 years ago and having to advocate for myself and just test the system. Like, a lot of what you're saying resonates with me there, and a lot of the advice to where the benefits for trans and non-binary folks within the company I work for, um, the benefits that are prevalent today and available are from the advice of the folks that were advocates and folks involved in employee resource groups. So it doesn't necessarily come from like benefits asking other people. They're asking directly to the employees what is needed. So that's awesome that you shared that. I'm going to ask this question to Joseph, Benny, and Manu, because I know, Joseph, you work with non-binary youth voices with the Speakers Bureau, and Benny, you work with Census and querying the census in 2020, and Manu, you also work with the support group at Billy DeFrank Center for non-binary folks. So based on some of your perspectives, what are some of the challenges that non-binary folks face today, other than the whole like pronouns and everything like that? Are there any other challenges that we should be looking at, thinking about? Almost there.
Who wants to go first? Sorry.
There we go. I see you on, Benny.
So I guess one of the things I guess in my capacity, in my role with the census, you know, one of the challenges is just that formal legal recognition, and I know also just in my own experience, like that there's a lot of challenges that come up with like kind of continuity of identity documents, or, you know, whether, you know, you're recognized legally in your state, or whether, you know, whether you are able to have everything kind of match up. And I know like some of the experiences are perhaps not something that all non-binary people are trying to work with in terms of like name changes, or getting, you know, their ID to have a gender marker that reflects their gender correctly. But I know that there's still a lot of basically paperwork that people have to work with that has like gender identity on it. And, you know, in terms of like the different systems, a lot of systems are still very gendered, whether it's, you know, restrooms, or whether it's programs in schools, or it's, you know, mental health services. A lot of times they're still separated by male and female, or, you know, there's still a lot of different programs that are separated by gender in a binary way. And part of what the Queers Count 2020 has been working on is trying to get more non-binary people to complete the census and complete the paper form and write in their gender, so that we can have more documentation, because when you send those forms in, the census has to scan them in and record that those people are identifying as non-binary, because currently that's not acknowledged on the census. And so the intention is to create grounds for legal recognition in the future. We're kind of looking at that as like a pathway into more legal recognition for non-binary people, by kind of setting this precedent that, you know, we are a large group. It's not just, you know, this sort of fringe identity, that there's a lot of people that identify that way, and that option is a more mainstream thing that should be available.
Awesome, thanks for sharing.
Yep. A lot of that resonates. Just, you know, of course, misgendering and pronouns is huge, and like constantly experiencing being misgendered in itself is very violent and just feels unsafe, but also just filling out forms, filling out health forms, filling out government forms. You know, it's always sex, male, female. Anytime I do see like, I mean, I laugh every time I see other, because I'm like, okay, well, I guess that's my gender of the day is other. But like, I am noticing that some organizations, some forms, like they do list non-binary, and, you know, they list trans, and they have these options. And it's like, those changes are so easy to make within the system, but it takes so long to make those changes happen. And it's like, why? Like, why? Like the politics or bureaucracy of it, I don't know. But those are definitely struggles that I know a lot of non-binary trans folks, you know, have to deal with. Especially, like, I just think it's ironic that especially if you're going to the clinic, you know, or to the doctors to talk about possible hormone replacement therapy, and then it's like seeing a form that says sex, male or female. It's just so ironic, and also just, it doesn't make sense to me. So I feel like if systems want to be inclusive of non-binary folks, they have to really make those other conscious active changes as well, and not just say that they're about it. And then for the support group, and also just my own personal experience as a non-binary person, just like having support from other folks. A lot of the folks in the group experience like kind of like this othering or this loneliness of like not really having family support or friend support. I feel very blessed that, you know, I have a great friend support in terms of like my other friends are also non-binary and awesome. But I do like lack that family support, especially as a Desi Punjabi queer non-binary person. It's just not really accepted or even talked about, you know. And anytime I try to attempt to like come out about being not necessarily, you know, cis and being non-binary, it's just kind of shut down. So those are just some of the challenges that I feel like other folks might be able to relate to.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, and I know I relate to a lot of what you were saying, Manu, and you know, as well as other gender expansive folks that were close to me. I think there is that sense of being othered, and again, at least in my personal experience, that anxiety that comes with like walking into a room and just automatically being aware that eyes are like on you, and it's because there's, you know, you're definitely standing out in a way, or folks are just really confused and you can see that confusion in their eyes. And I mean, I think you certainly do get used to that after a certain amount of time, but I mean, there's just always that anxiety of, you know, feeling pressure of, you know, having attention on you and being othered, because, you know, I think non-binary is still relatively a new term to a lot of folks in general who aren't knowledgeable of the community. And so, you know, a lot of folks are barely getting their brains wrapped around the idea of gender expansiveness and, you know, identities beyond just male or female. So just definitely the way that the world interacts with us, still certainly a challenge.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I like what you said there, Joseph, about feeling othered, or when you go into a space, being kind of like people's eyes on you. And I want to direct this question to Cordelia, because I had the pleasure of meeting Cordelia at the Black Trans Lives Matter event that happened at the DeFrank Center. Cordelia works for a group called Hero 10, and Hero 10's out there every day being active allies to the Black communities and uplifting the protests for Black Lives Matter, and seeing them surprisingly show up at my event for Black Trans Lives Matter, I was just like, whoa, this is amazing. So in terms of being an active ally and making those spaces, and from what I've witnessed through these protests, is that there are a lot of queer folks, specifically there are a lot of non-binary and trans folks at these protests, which is for me, and this goes to what Joseph was saying, I just feel a little bit more welcome when I see a trans flag, a rainbow flag, or a non-binary flag, because I just feel that, okay, now I have a little bit of support just in case, like it's identification, then I slowly make my way towards those people, especially towards those protests, because it's just identity and it's feeling comfortable. But Cordelia, you're there like almost every weekend, if not every day, supporting BLM. So can you talk to us a little bit about active allyship and activism?
So what you were noting about finding a lot of queer people, a lot of trans people, a lot of non-binary people at these types of events, I find that because we've been on societal margins and fringes for the majority of our existences, being closeted or out, there's kind of a call to action that a lot of us feel when another group of people is marginalized, is oppressed, is targeted. You feel that there's an empathy there. For myself, I am, you know, non-binary, femme, Asian American, and there's so much intersection in our communities. You know, none of these are any one individual's fight. Like, when it comes to issues of race, if the Asian community doesn't show up for the Black community doesn't show up for the Hispanic community doesn't show up for Pacific Islander, if we don't have that sense of allyship in our own communities, if the gay community doesn't show up for the trans community doesn't show up for intersex, doesn't show up for, we lose traction, we lose power, we lose our voices. You can't divide yourselves by smaller labels. We have to come together as a force and fight the mainly white patriarchal cis hetero standards that we are all being held to. And that's why I feel like in positions of allyship and activism, really anyone that's felt marginalized in their life comes out to these to support and say, hey, this isn't necessarily my direct fight, but I'm going to fight for you. because I know what it feels like to feel othered, to feel different, to feel left out and oppressed. And I'm going to help you fight that feeling.
Awesome. Thanks you for sharing. Does anybody else have any thoughts on active allyship and or intersectionality?
Well, one thing I just wanted to know, so Bayard Rustin, which if folks don't know, he's kind of the person who was behind the civil rights movement and kind of organized most of the things that MLK did. And he was an out gay man who was arrested multiple times and in some ways was kind of left for history to forget. But he said you have to join every other movement for the freedom of people, right? And so this is, in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, he recognized this, right? And so my theory about many things is that other people said it better than I ever will say it. And so that's how I feel. Like you have to kind of go out and you have to participate. You have to be part of the conversation. You have to be knowledgeable about how other groups of people are being marginalized or mistreated because you're not that far away from it, right? It doesn't matter who you are in this world or how much success you have. There's a lot of ways that people can other you. And so being educated and being willing to fight is the number one way to actually actively protect yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we all live in California, at least I'm assuming, unless you're working remotely somewhere else that I don't know about. But back in January 2019, it was rolled out with the non-binary gender marker being represented or available for state-issued California IDs. What do you folks feel is the importance of that? Is that a significant thing to have on an identity document such as your California driver's license? Is this a step forward? I mean, I feel it's a step forward, but I want to get your folks' thoughts as to having non-binary representation on something like a California ID.
So I want to start this off because when I moved here, I moved here from Chicago, so they didn't have this in Chicago, right? Like whatever. So I remember going and I just had, so most people, Sera knows, but I had spinal fusion surgery last year. So when I went to go get my California driver's license, I was in like my neck brace and everything. And so people were already feeling very sympathetic. But I went up to the lady and I was like, so I need this like driver's license. And I heard there's like a non-binary situation. And she was just like, oh my God, you're my first one. She's like, like this is gonna be so great. She's like, there's a form I have to go get. And she's like, baby, are you excited? I was like, I am excited too. And like literally we were just so excited to do this non-binary driver's license. But I honestly took a picture of that and I sent it to like every single one of my friends. I sent it to my cousins. I sent it to my uncles and aunts because I was like, look at it. It actually has my identity on it. So like, do I think it's a big deal? Hell yes, I think it's a big deal, right? Because the thing about government is that they take the fun out of everything, right? Like, you have to do all these things that are not cool, right? But this is the one thing I was just like, oh my gosh, this actually feels like such a great affirming thing. And it's going to make a difference to people because you can only, like, a lot of times you can only aspire to what you can recognize. Like, again, I'm from Mississippi, right? And so for me, growing up, I didn't have any of these examples, right? When I think about Billions, right? Taylor Mason on Billions, like Asia, I was like, that is literally who I thought I wanted to be, but that character didn't exist for me. So a lot of times when you have like these type of institutional changes, like it's like, oh, I can really actually be this person for the very first time.
I think creating an office of LGBTQ affairs might be the second coolest thing that I hope. I hope we're trying to be cooler as a government-run operative. The reason why my eyes lit up when you said that, B, is because when I got my gender pronoun changed at the DMV, the person that helped me out, that was their first one. And they were just like, their eyes lit up and they catered to, it was like the best experience at the DMV ever because they just felt like they wanted to help out so bad. So that's why I was just like, ah, that's so cool. Anybody else in terms of California ID? Is this a step in the right direction? Obviously it is, but some thoughts as to why this is an important thing.
I think it's a step in the right direction, but also, I mean, I personally don't have a non-binary gender marker on my ID because for me, that doesn't, in my experience of like the last, I guess like 5 years of having female on my ID and having the incorrect name and having that be such a hugely disruptive and often unsafe situation for me. I personally don't feel like a non-binary identity marker is something that's totally accessible to everyone yet. And until there is more infrastructure set up, I think until you have it on there, a lot of times you don't realize how many different systems don't really line up. And when you have something on your ID, in my experience for 5 years of having something on my ID that didn't match up with my identity, and having people look at my ID and get really confused, or sometimes, you know, I would go somewhere, you know, go to see a band and have someone grab my ID and not want to give it back because they think it's fake, or you know, just all kinds of different situations. I personally don't feel comfortable continuing to have to deal with that. And I think a lot of people, until they have more reassurance that they're going to be able to travel, that they're going to be able to get healthcare that they need, that they're going to be able to like be treated with the same rights as everyone else, despite having a non-binary gender marker on their ID, it's really not accessible and practical to everyone yet. And it's a step in the right direction, but it's a step, you know.
There's two things that stand out to me with the non-binary marker. For me personally, I was looking at getting my gender marker changed on my ID, and that stopped when all of the affronts to transgender healthcare came to a front. I have a blessing and at the same time very dysphoric curse of being cis passing, and I have a lot of underlying medical conditions, sadly. I appear very able-bodied passing, but I have a heart condition, I have asthma, I have scoliosis, I have hip dysplasia. My access to healthcare for all of those things could go away if I changed that gender marker. And that's terrifying. And it's not fair. So I don't feel like I am safe enough to express my gender on my card. Ooh, I didn't realize how much this has affected me emotionally. When I feel I'm safe enough and will be taken care of in a health perspective, maybe I will feel like I can change that gender marker and truly express who I am on something as silly as a government-issued ID. Until then, I will just rely on the affirming allyship of my very dear friends to remind me that that little F on my ID doesn't mean anything.
You're awesome. Thank you for sharing. And I know, Joseph, you came off mute just a little bit. Did you want to share anything?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like folks have all shared, you know, similar sentiments on it. But for me, you know, I'm certainly happy that I live in a state where, you know, I feel recognizes and represents my identity and is willing to do that on a government issued ID. I'm not even sure it's just a priority for me personally in my experience. I don't know if it would add anything for me, you know, just having like a physical thing on a card. I mean, I've spent so many years, you know, in my experience, and I think I'm just happy with knowing who I am and grateful that there's a word for it. And I feel very affirmed from the people in my family and friends. So I'm not sure I need more than that. And you know, I have no problem accessing like healthcare for myself. And so again, it just doesn't seem, it's, you know, if it's not broken, why fix it kind of thing almost, but not quite. But I'm just very fortunate, you know, to have, you know, that accessible to me if I ever feel like I need to have that changed.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think the sentiments go out through, and I'm looking at the chat right now. Thank you all for sharing your vulnerability. I know sometimes putting it out there is pretty rough, but let's not forget today is International Non-Binary People's Day, and it's all about you folks. Are there any folks out there that you folks look up to? Is there any like celebrities or crushes maybe, or Instagram folks or anyone that you look up to when it comes to celebrating non-binary folks within the community, non-binary leaders? So I celebrate you folks, obviously, but who are some folks that you folks would say maybe you want to start following as they are leaders within the non-binary communities?
I have two right off the bat with this that I absolutely adore. One is India Moore. I absolutely like. I admire, I idolize, I worship India Moore. I think they are a fantastic individual, and they are non-binary, trans femme non-binary, and it's very often assumed because of their feminine appearance that they identify as female, and they've corrected multiple times on Twitter. They take on trolls all the time of saying, no, this is my identity, and you don't get to take that away from me just because you think I present a certain way and check a certain box for you. One of my favorite things they commented on was, I think it was about Pose, but they were talking about a character they were playing that was trans, and someone was celebrating, look, they cast a trans actress in a trans role, and India came back and said, any role that I play is trans and is non-binary. There doesn't need to be a specification to it. I myself, like, my identity goes into that character as well. And I thought, as a non-binary actor, that was one of the most validating things I've ever read. So I really highly recommend following India Moore on any and all platforms. If nothing else, just gaze at how gorgeous they are, for real. That hair, just legendary. The other person I would highly recommend following is Erica Hart. Erica Hart is a breast cancer survivor who has spoken a lot on Black queer activism, and they've opened my eyes and my heart to a lot of hard truths that I didn't even realize I had internalized against. So a lot of my discovery of my own non-binary identity came through following their page, because I had this very, very internalized fear that, I don't know, that if I didn't check certain boxes of my assigned female gender, if I didn't, if I wasn't performative in my femininity, that, there was just a lot of complex emotions going on, right? But Erica Hart and their very direct, hardline work, it's not gentle. I will warn you. They are not gentle about the things they say. They don't sugarcoat. They don't beat around the bush. But they will open your mind to a lot of things that we societally need to process, including our own internalized grudges and biases.
Thanks for sharing, Cordelia. Anybody else have any folks that we recommend to start following, or anyone you admire?
Definitely agree with India Moore. They're like everything to me, especially as a femme non-binary. Like, they're my idol for sure. I also just want to give a shout out to my best friends, X, Keen, Amanda. They're also non-binary, and the connection that we have has been life-changing and everything for me. So just kind of giving them a shout out. And I also just want to take this space to also mention that, we really have to be active allies in the Black Lives Movement, especially Black trans lives. Black trans women are at such a high risk here. And as non-binary folks, as folks part of the queer community, like, we really do need to take more of an active step.
Thanks for sharing. All right. All right, so we're about at time. I want to give a big fat thank you. And if you look at this chat, folks, like, everybody is just saying how appreciative they are with your time today. Really briefly, feel free to come off your mic and let us know where we could follow you at on the socials, if you have a socials. I saw Cordelia go off first.
Oh, did I? That was me accidentally hitting my mic, but sure, we'll take that as going first.
Where could you follow you at?
My Instagram is at COCOLAOSIN, Coco Larson. Real bad inside joke with friends from years ago, and at this point I'm just stuck with the handle because I'm too lazy to change it. So
Awesome.
COCOLAOSIN, Coco Larson. Also, if you want to be involved with more protest and activism in the South Bay especially, go ahead and follow our organization hero_tent on Instagram. And feel free to reach out to me or my friends on either of those Instagrams. I'm always happy to make connections.
Awesome. Thank you, Cordelia. How about you, B?
Yeah, so it's just my name. So I'm old and I like just using my name. So it's just B Pagels Minor on Twitter, Instagram. I even created a TikTok. I don't participate. I just like to watch the video. I'm not gonna lie about that. So the videos are amazing. And then also on Facebook. So you can find me everywhere on the internet. Just at my name.
Awesome. Thank you, B. Joseph, how about yourself?
You can certainly follow the youth space on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, only because it's a lot funner than my Instagram that I don't think I actually put content on, kind of like what B said. I just kind of, what's the word? I'm like audience, or
I
like
to voyeur.
Yeah, there you go, voyeur. Yes. But so yeah, you can at least find the youth space on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by just searching the LGBTQ youth space, and just stay in the loop with any kind of events or cool projects that we put together.
All right, thank you, Joseph. Benny, anything you want the audience to follow?
Yes, so you can follow Queers Count for the census project, and that's at QCount 2020 on Twitter or Queers Count 2020 on Instagram, and also queerscount2020@gmail.com if you have any questions. There was someone that asked a question, so you're welcome to follow up there. And then for my tattooing Instagram, that's just Ben Cadmium, but that's not really, that's kind of just art Instagram. It's for fun.
Make sure you follow that because it's an amazing page. If you don't follow the Tat Instagram, you should definitely do so. And last but not least, Manu, anything where we could find you or where we should look at?
So I linked my Instagram and Twitter. They're the same in the chat, but it's MXMANUKAUR. And then you can also email me manu@defrank.org if you want the link for the weekly Thursday support group meeting.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And if you folks want to follow Office of LGBTQ Affairs, again, you could just keyword search Sera and Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs, or you can follow us on Instagram and Twitters at LGBTQSCCGOV. Again, a lot of letters, but you could also just keyword search that. Virtual round of applause to y'all for celebrating a non-binary People's Day. Everyone that's still remaining, feel free to light up that chat and show them just how appreciative you are. Again, thank you, Cordelia, B, Joseph, Manu, and Benny for joining us today. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. Happy International Non-Binary People's Day. Thank you so much for joining, and make sure to follow these folks, and we will see y'all soon. Take care, shelter in place. Goodbye for now.